tell you in a few seconds that it's recording. It takes a minute.
Now you'll guide us through when I've never used this, how to put like your slides up for everybody to see them and all that.
Very all right. So I'll guide you right through it. Very easy. So welcome everyone to the American Politics One panel, Presidency and Congress for the 2021 New York State Political Science Association virtual conference, being hosted by Elmira College. Yes, Harry, you weren't here, but that Elmira College is my undergraduate institution, and Dr. Twombly was my undergraduate mentor. So we're coming full circle after all these years. I think you're muted, Jim. I can't hear you.
I take no responsibility whatsoever.
Yeah, that's fair. Hey, I was for the first time ever, I was on time.
And I was late.
Yeah, so here's how this is going to go. We're good. We're scheduled to about 1:30, but we'll take about 15 minutes per panel. So it gives ample opportunity, per paper, ample opportunity to discuss what I have for you all and discuss amongst yourselves. If you're interested in sharing a PowerPoint presentation, if you've never used Teams before, if you go up, there should be a little arrow button. If you should at the top, it should look like an arrow in a box, a white box.
Yeah.
That's the share button.
Okay.
You should all have access to be able to share and that it's pretty simple. It's just if you use Zoom, it's very similar to Zoom. It'll pin to people, or you can have the 4 squares. And then other than that, though, we keep the chat. If you see the little lines next to people, that's the chat. You can leave the chat open in case anybody has questions through the chat. Like your typical Zoom meeting or Teams meeting, if you're not presenting, we'll have you be on mute, so there's not that nice background echo effect. But other than that, though, we can get this party started. And if we don't mind, I'll probably just go in order of the pictures I have on the screen right here, which would be Jared, Eric, Harry, then Jim. Go right in that kind of order how I'm seeing y'all. Is that sound good to everyone?
Fine.
All right.
Just tell us, because our order is different than yours.
Yeah, I figured. I realized as I was saying that through, I'm like, so I'll just keep you going. So we'll start with Jared, then go to Eric. So on that note, Jared, take it away.
Okay, so everyone, my name is Jared Stefani. I'm at the United States Military Academy, and I am a major in the United States military. I teach American politics and international relations. Today, I want to talk about my research project, which is Senate voting on defense spending. So I'm going to be taking a look at the appropriations, not just the National Defense Authorization Act, which gets the majority of the attention. So here's my agenda, and I'm going to only focus on a few variables that I found that were quite interesting. I think that the panel will find interesting as well. So why did I start studying this? Well, we know that the defense budget remains the most, one of the most contentious pieces of legislation each year based on its size and because it's only one of the only vehicles of legislation that can get passed. So there's a lot of additional riders and things that get put onto it. And usually it falls into 2 camps. One is that you think that the defense budget is too big, needs to be reduced so you can have more domestic spending. Or 2, you think that the defense budget is large enough or potentially could need to be increased for all the national security concerns that are out there. So this graph right here just shows 1948 to 2018. And there's about a $550 billion holding 2020 dollars constant that traditionally the DoD gets every year. And that does not include veterans for it. Now, as you can see, during the Reagan buildup, as well as during the war period of OEF and OIF, there was more funding that came to the military for those. My study is going to look at 1997 to 2018, and specifically the Senate. And what we see is we'll maintain that $550 billion average. But what's really interesting is after the Great Recession, we're going to see these continuing resolutions really take hold of the legislation process, where the DoD had to be delayed in receiving its budget. So if you take right here, we've had a large increase in continuing resolutions for that. Now, I wanted to explore the Defense Appropriations Act, not the National Defense Authorization. So the authorization tells the size, the structure, and authorizes appropriations. But when it comes down to brass tacks, actually writing the check, that's the Defense Appropriations Act. So that's why I wanted to focus at. And if you can see from my graph on the left, there's a clear difference between what you're voting for the NDAA and what is actually getting voted yay on the DAA. So the puzzle that I have is, why is there a difference between them? And is there a signal, like you're trying to signal that you're supportive of defense spending versus actual action based on that? So that leads me to my 5 major hypotheses that I have: partisanship, ideology, the sex, if you're a veteran, and the state economic interest that comes from defense spending. The model that I used was a multivariant logistic regression model using 16 different variables. And today, I want to highlight partisanship, ideological proximity, and state economic interests. And I will say something about veterans, which is pretty interesting, that occurred. So let's look at the effects of the key variables. What I wanted to highlight was veteran status actually doesn't matter for your support, right? It's not statistically significant. So a lot of people think, oh, if you're a veteran, you're more likely to support defense spending because you have lived that experience, you understand the importance of it. But in actuality, that was not found. It kind of goes back to the whole, it's based on your ideology and your partisanship, like most of the literature out there is saying. Additionally, the other variables that I control for, they didn't really matter as well. Now, being a Republican did, as you can tell from this one, and that correlates with the common perception in the literature that Republicans in general have a higher support rate for defense spending. But it's also important to note to look at the lines, right? So you have about 62% to about 65.5. So there still is a large majority of support on both parties. Both parties like defense spending for that. And then I broke it down by sex. And this correlates with the literature as well, where women in general tend to support more appropriations compared to their male counterparts. And that kind of correlates with it. What I found really interesting, though, is because we have this common perception of Democrats versus Republicans. If we take a look at ideological proximity, that's where I think the interesting finding is. And what I found there is actually the more ideological extreme you are, the less likely you are to support defense spending, and the more moderate you are, the more likely you are. So that kind of goes against this narrative that Democrats are anti-defense and like all Republicans are strong on defense, because correlate ideology and party are pretty highly correlated. And what's even more interesting about this is the depending on how moderate between the two parties is there. So what I'm telling you is we have party variation going on within the two political parties. And you might say, well, why does that matter? Well, as we see from the ideological proximity of Congress, it continues to have a gap where moderates no longer have, really a say what's going on in Congress as we've moved along the ideological spectrum towards the more extremes of the party. And what we see is there is a potential bimodal split occurring in the Republican Party, who have traditionally been very strong on defense. And the question is, how is this going to impact future defense spending legislation? Now, do I think that the DAAs aren't going to pass? No, I don't think that. But I think it's going to be a lot of shaping from those senators to make sure that they get what they want on that DAA, or at least a reduced spending. And the next one I want to focus on is state economic interests. And, what's interesting is the majority of military bases are going to be in what we call the Southern Smile, right? So this is what we're going to talk about. This is where the majority of the bases are. But when we take a look at it, the higher for Republicans and Democrats, the model shows, the higher your state is reliant on its GDP for defense, the lower you are likely to vote yay. And that was really puzzling me because I thought it'd be the inverse where, hey, if you are reliant on defense spending, you would actually be more supportive of it. I then broke it down by party, and I think this can explain it. My hypothesis that the more reliant on defense spending, the more likely you are to say yay on the defense appropriations bill holds true for the Democrats. It's the Republicans where we see this big split here. So Democrats, it's about 61 to 63, so it's pretty limited, it's not very robust. But when you take a look at the difference between the most min GDP and the most max GDP, it's about a 10% difference, which is really interesting that's out there. And I controlled for one individual senator. So everyone's always like, "Oh, it's because Rand Paul's out there." No, Rand Paul is actually such a minute part of my data set that it's not just one senator bringing down. It's a collection of those senators that I hope to do future research on to see why exactly they're doing that. So that brings me to my limitations in future study. So the limitations, I did not look at the role of lobbying on senators, right, with corporations. But I do need to highlight that corporations are not fools. They give money to all political candidates, right? And then a good example is the F-35 program that has some sort of its manufacturing in 48 states, right? So it makes it pretty difficult to cancel that program because it would have impact on your constituents. The other one is, everyone always says, hey, you should have more data to see these trends over time. The reason why I did 1997 is because the DoD data that I use for like military accessions, recruitment, military personnel is pretty limited pre-1997. So I was kind of constrained right there. And we're living in this post-Trumpism way when we don't know if the Republicans are going to move towards the populist movement or more of that classical Republican sentiment. And then for future studies, does this apply to the House? And also, who's the one that's flipping between the NDAA and the DAA? I think that's going to be kind of interesting. And then I would be able to, take out specific characteristics of those senators. So that concludes my brief today. Looking forward to any of your comments or questions on that. And there is my contact information if you have any questions.
All right, thank you. I really appreciate that. I'm gonna mute you here for a second. So I will say, I'll reserve my comments to the end, but I do think this is really interesting. You hit one of the good questions on why 1997. So if I forget to bring back up 1997 during the comments, remind me. But I have an argument on that. Well, thank you. All right. On that note, we'll transition over to Harry and Harry's paper on, I have it the wrong way, legislating against liberties. So Harry, feel free and take it away.
Great, thanks. Everyone can hear me, I trust. Great, thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me. So yeah, I'm a PhD candidate at the City University of New York. Do most of my teaching at City College, most of my learning at the Grad Center. And I don't really have a PowerPoint because I don't think that my paper is super amenable to that. There were some charts and graphs in there in one of the earlier drafts, but that felt rather forced. So now it's just plain old text. So I'm just going to summarize the basic idea of the paper for you in words, and it'll also kind of hint a bit at my broader project that I'm doing for my dissertation, which is kind of applying similar ideas to different case studies throughout US history. I guess I would say that my paper is a little bit unorthodox for a political science conference in the sense that it's probably more in the realm of constitutional law, and it's more in debates among constitutional law scholars than it is among debates with political scientists per se, although I think increasingly these two areas are overlapping in productive ways. And the basic issue that I'm grappling with is I feel that in both American politics, but also a lot in comparative politics, when scholars have been writing about the relationship between emergency powers, wars, other kinds of emergencies like, let's say, pandemics, and restrictions on civil liberties or deeper harms to democratic government, the key mechanism seems to be the expansion of executive power. Focus seems to be on the expansion of executive power. You get a war, you get some other kind of crisis, and understandably, given the urgency of the situation, you will see the legislature delegate power to the executive, and you'll have the judiciary generally not want to wade into any of these controversies during a crisis moment. But you have no clear guarantee that the executive is going to nicely hand over this power once the emergency passes. Indeed, you might have situations in which the emergency is indefinitely extended when we don't really know if we're living in a state of emergency or not. It does seem to me, however, from both a reading of US history and even more contemporary issues such as the ongoing war on terror, that the role of legislatures in all of this has been pretty woefully under-theorized by both con law scholars and more orthodox political scientists. It seems to me that to the extent that we're writing about the role of legislatures, we're really focusing on whether and the extent to which legislatures are delegating power to the executive. So the focus is very much on delegation. I would say delegation or disinterest. These would be the principal sins that are thrown in the way of legislatures when it comes to creating problems for civil liberties. My argument in this paper is that, actually legislatures can do a lot more than that. And the US Congress can certainly do a lot more than that. And often in ways that are distinctly negative for civil liberties. Indeed, this case, which is the aftermath of the Second World War, it bleeds into early McCarthyism, but actually most of what I'm writing about is before Joseph McCarthy meaningfully comes onto the political scene. You have a major war. You have definitely a greater concentration of executive power during that war. You have the Roosevelt administration, which is, I think, widely seen as one that exercises executive power in ways that we hadn't necessarily seen before. And so you have these different elements there where you would expect this kind of executive power hypothesis to hold water, expansion of this power, and then, restrictions on civil liberties that continue after the war. But really what is happening after the war is that there is a reassertion of congressional power, a reassertion of congressional authority, but there is actually probably a degeneration of civil liberties in many ways. And so I'm trying to figure out why that is. And my core point, I suppose, is that the Congress is infringing on civil liberties not really by passing legislation. It's one of this kind of interesting features of the McCarthyite period or the post-Second World War period, that the Congress doesn't do that much in the way of legislating, with maybe the exception of the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947. The Internal Security Act of 1950 is very repressive on paper, but it's barely implemented or enforced. Rather, the main ways in which Congress exercises power, the main ways in which Congress restricts civil liberties during this time is through its investigative powers, its contempt power, which is not written anywhere in the Constitution, but is rather an implied power of the Congress, and through informal relationships with the bureaucracy, particularly the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover. And I document in the paper the various ways that this relationship works, be it the more orthodox stuff that I think we associate with Hoover a fair bit these days, which is basically just leaking dirt on political enemies, but also other links that involve his attempts to publicly legitimize the work of some of these congressional committees. And then I also have a piece on the way that members of Congress are bullying the judiciary. And I think this is something that we don't see that much written on in the literature, at least so far as the Congress using this power over the judiciary's jurisdiction, the Supreme Court's appellate jurisdiction, to basically, threaten the judiciary. That you won't be able to hear these classes of cases. And I'm struck by investigating this historically, but it is a feature of the post 9/11 era as well, when the Congress strips the Supreme Court of its authority to hear habeas petitions for Guantanamo prisoners. So basically what I'm trying to do is bring to attention some of these features of the legislative role, the congressional role, that haven't really been explored. I'm doing it in a case that is arguably an easy case for my argument. And I'd be interested to hear more from Josh and others about whether that's a fair criticism. It probably is. And maybe I would be better off finding a more difficult case for my argument. But the idea is to get that conversation going among scholars and continue that conversation that I'm having with myself. And yeah, I look forward to everybody's comments. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. You made an interesting observation. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit more. Don't beat yourself up too much on the case selection. I think you got a good start of an idea, though. So more to come. All right. On that note, Eric, take it away.
Okay, let me unmute myself. I gotta find my How do I find my screen?
You're looking for the share screen?
Yeah, I'm in there, but I'm looking for my, can anybody see that or no? I'm
Not
looking
seeing
at,
anything yet. It's coming.
oh, share. Okay, share.
Here it comes. There you go.
Is it still there?
Yep, it was.
I gotta get it back.
Yep. You gotta
Oh,
read it.
I might have hit stop sharing by mistake. Share. Come on, get up there. Is it there?
Yes, it is.
Okay, sorry. Technical me.
That's all right.
So I'm just going to quickly go over a little project I'm working on. This is really in its infancy stages here, so it's not a whole lot here. It's more of a measurement piece than an actual, here's a theory about X, Y, and Z, and this is how I'm going to prove it. I was struck in all of the different things I get myself into, and one of them is legislative productivity. This is a much bigger discussion in the literature, maybe 10, 15 plus years ago, about how how scholars determine what is a successful legislature or a successful presidency or what not. And I was struck at how dissatisfying it is the way in which we say one is better than another. Okay. And so the purpose of, or the goal of this project, at least as I'm envisioning it now, is to try to figure out a better way in which we could measure something in an objective way that is comparable across time and space, particularly space. I mean time, particularly time. So, as I say here, the goal of the project is a state of research on legislative productivity fails to account for, let's say, all enacted law. They tend to focus on landmark legislation only, and the amount of floor effort in how it calculates success. So I'm trying to do in this paper is a way to put all of that together and to move beyond these simple things of saying one legislature is better because it has, you know, so many more landmark legislation enacted than another. And I create this metric, which I didn't intend it to be this little tail thing, but I don't know if I'll ever use that again, but it's just the way what I have now. So if you look at most current, or what's out there in the literature on how you determine legislative productivity, there's usually, the way I could see it, is three ways. One is simply count of landmark enactments, with Mayhew and his famous Divided We Govern book being the kind of the start of this, the impetus of this. Others use his studies, use his work and put it into theirs. Stasis, he does everything since from the 1798 to 2012, I think he did it. And simply all they do is they look at, or they use historical overviews of what people consider are these major enactments. And they say, here it is, here's a list. These guys had, or this era had more, this era had less, and you're off and running. Some scholars have managed to look beyond just simple counts of landmark legislation. Cameron and Howell et al., it's essentially the same study. I think they took one from the other and he threw it in the book. They try to do counts. They list everything as ranking is from A, B, C, D, and E, A, B, C, and D with their legislation, with landmark being A, not that big being D, et cetera, et cetera. Don't need to belabor the point there. And others still rely on counts, but they use more statistical methods. So, for instance, Clinton and Lipinski, they use a multi-dimensional scaling technique, which is the same thing you would use to get ideal point estimations. I do a lot of that stuff. And you just set your stuff up based on how historians rank certain laws. You have it's just a giant matrix, in other words, with all scholars ranking certain laws, and every law that's ever been enacted. Who gets votes yes will get a better score. If there's no votes no's, they get a lower or negative score. And the other guys there, they use what's his name, Simon's measure of I forget what he calls it, like public effectiveness or public mood. That's it. They use Stimson's public mood measure, and that's how they get their scores. But overall, the point is that it just counts. Usually the big thing is counts of landmark legislation. That's it. That's what you generally will see. So I question, why should we only look at landmark legislation? Sure, they're important, but there are certain limitations to this. One, in the era that I'm looking in now, which I'm going to extend it, but I'm only between the 87th and the 115th Congress, because that's the only amount of time that I had to be able to get through this. It's a long and laborious process. Your average laws, average landmark laws that are passed are 12 laws with a standard deviation of 4, meaning if you're between 8 and 16, you're well within this range. So there's not a lot of variation between each Congress and the amount of landmark laws that are passed. Second point is, how do we determine if one is better than the other? If it's just like, hey, we passed 12, you passed only 11, we're one better than you. Look at us, we're off and running, right? Is that a real way to really think about it? What would be that level? You know, a full standard deviation above? Possibly, yes. And another point, and this is a much more, I think, ingrained problem here, is that when you look at how landmark legislation is classified, you'll often see things like, for instance, here I have the Voting Rights Act, which anybody would agree is a pretty big enacted piece of law, but also the Y2K Planning Act. That, you know, the Y2K thing was a big bust, but that's considered a landmark enactment in Mayhew's classification alone. And I think one problem here is that each year, all the scholars and all the journalists look at all the important laws that are passed, and they need to write on something. And so, hey, look, there's another 10, but they're not really all that important. So are we really measuring what is really important as far as landmark is, or what landmark isn't, or significant, etc.? I just have a quick graph here. Here's the mean across all landmark enactments between the 87th and 115th Congress. And if you look between 6 and 4, if you imagine that, or 6 and 8, 16 and 8, you would see that most of these Congresses would fall within that range. There's a few that are above, there are a few that are low, but you know, you could see that, you know, it's not a whole much variation. It's you wouldn't get too nuts on that. So what I'm trying to do is to create a measure that does these three things. One, in my opinion, legislative productivity, should account for all enacted laws. Landmark laws are important, and they should be weighted more importantly, but other things should matter as well. For instance, if you have two fictitious Congresses and one passes, let's say, 5 landmark laws and little else, and another one passes only 1, but a lot of other laws, who would we rate as more successful? Of course, we'd have to look into the substantive quality of what those landmark laws are, but, you know, what are we left with? So we need to weight these specific laws in a way that gives weight to some and not as much weight to others, but in a way that accounts for everything. Also, in my opinion, the amount of flaw work that goes into passing laws should matter to some degree. Legislatures that spend less time enacting laws, and a lot of important laws, should be rewarded more than those who need a lot more roll calls to get things done, particularly if they spend a lot more roll calls to get things done and they pass less laws. And finally, these accomplishments should be scaled on a comparable metric that we could use to measure degrees of success, okay? Quickly, I just wanted to show you, these are how I rank each law. I have them from a first to a top tier being landmark laws. You can see there's really not a lot of them. The third tier is all appropriations bills that are passed in each legislative session. So what I did is I went to the U.S. statutes at large and looked at every single law that was in these in each chapter and classified them by the number of pages that each law has. Of course, landmark legislation here, I'm just relying on Mayhew's. I have no choice but to rely on that, but they tend to have the most pages anyway. Appropriations bills sometimes could have, you know, 800-900 pages, so they get a lot. And for the first and second categories, the first category particularly has commemorative legislation, all House joint resolutions or Senate joint resolutions. And what I do is I look at the average page numbers in each session, each term, I should say, and whatever falls below the average of that term is moved into the first category, and whatever is above the average falls into the second category. In other words, if a law is not really that important but has a decent number of pages to it, perhaps there's a lot more in there that would mean it means it's something more than a little one. And you can see there's a lot of first stage laws compared to everything else that are passed. There's a lot of those, okay? That's most of Congress's work, is passing these bills. Some bills that may have one or two sentences in them. You know, a continuing appropriations act will say we'll continue the appropriations till next week or something like that, and that's it. So this is how I measure it. All I do, I take legislative impact on the first equation. Each section, I multiply them by a value. So the first is just essentially itself. It's a sum of all of those counts. The next one is the sum of the second one's times a higher value, third, top, divided by all floor attempts. All floor attempts are all roll calls in both chambers and all voice votes, everything, right? And I divided by the sum of that, and you get this legislative impact score. For the attempts, or the effectiveness, I should say, it's all the summation of all laws in each chamber, and that is both public and private laws. Again, by the sum of all attempts, it gives me this effectiveness score. And then I create what I have here as tail at the end, which is simply legislative impact plus, or in addition to the effectiveness score, divided by the mean of that score for all Congresses. So the top part of the equation is just the measure for each Congress, and it's divided by the average across all Congresses, and I times that, multiply that by 100, so you could put that on a comparable scale. And what that would mean is anything that's below 100 falls below the congressional average, and anything above it is better. So here you could see before the 90-something Congress, most of these are essentially 50% better than anything else in the sample. And you get a little bit more here around the Reagan area, and everything after that is below this average. I'm probably taking up too much time, so I'll quickly just say that I wanted to say, let me move out all of the first tier laws and see what that would look like. Maybe I'm, you know, erroneously giving value to some more than others. And you can see there's a bit of a change in this. Some of those ones early on fell down because they passed so much first tier laws, but at the end you can still see some of them are still the same. That is, Congresses that passed more appropriations bill or weighted more, et cetera, et cetera. But to me, I think the first measure has to be better because it accounts for everything, and that's what everything is what it is. So let me just take a sip. For my mind, this measure kind of meets the goals I outlined. It puts everything on a metric that you could weight everything by its value. You look at all floor action, and you can get a substantive measure that you can compare across time. There are questions. Is it fair for some legislators to score higher due to tier 1 laws? But I guess they passed them and other ones didn't. Is overall floor action a fair assessment? Maybe some people put more work in than others, and it just takes them longer. This in particular penalizes Democrat majorities because they tend to use more roll calls to get to their point. Republican majorities tend to have less roll calls in their assessments. And finally, are some penalized because of certain conditions? I've noticed that a lot of the Congresses in our polarized area tend to fare much worse, but I guess that is a condition of what is happening. If there's any comments on that, we can talk about that. And then moving forward, I just look to extend this data set to all legislators. There's a lot of work to do this. It takes a lot of time to even figure out how many voice votes there are in each Congress. It's a big task to try to calculate what that is. Should I make this a study that I put in point predictions, you know, do a regression, whatever, some type of time series analysis, polarization, divided government, et cetera, et cetera? And also, should I just leave this a measurement piece, or should I make this a piece about something where I'm looking at, here's a theory, I'm going to look at something and use this measure to prove or disprove that theory. So with that, that's what I have. I feel I took up a little bit too much time and a little too boring, but I will stop sharing now, and I look forward to any comments. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric. No, I think you did great on time. So we're moving right along. And then with that note, we'll move right to Jim, so Jim can have his presentation. Then we can have a kind of an open discussion on comments and ideas about the papers.
Okay, let me find. Okay, why can't I find what I want to share?
It's the arrow button in the white
Oh,
box.
I got that, Josh. I just I guess like Eric, I can't find the see my entire screen. No application window. There it is. Okay. I had to click on it first. So let me.
There it is.
Yeah, let me get it to the slideshow. Okay. Got the title page?
We got the title page.
All right. Excellent.
Should be coming soon.
Just like class. All right. So my paper is entitled Delegitimizing the Presidency, Narrow Victories, Popular Vote Losers, Impeachment, and Insurrection. To be honest, the insurrection part got a little bit of short shrift. It's used more as an introduction than anything else. But you can sort of close the loop yourself once we go through this and see where I was headed with it. So this notion of delegitimizing came to me looking at efforts most recently, obviously, with the insurrection on January 6th, where the big lie was used to attempt to delegitimize the incoming president and perhaps even, most importantly, fully delegitimized by attempting to not certify the results of the election. But it occurred to me that, too, there were other attempts to delegitimize presidents. And interestingly enough, not only did the insurrection come from one individual, but so did this next category of it, and that is undermining the qualifications of an individual, and that is the birtherism movement against Barack Obama. But if you look further, there are other ways that presidents can be delegitimized. You can disqualify them, or you can impeach them. But what are the antecedents? Is it just a narrow victory? Is it that the person ascended to the presidency accidentally? The text goes into a little bit of that. And then is it polarization or deep political division? And I use the alternative, more generic term there of deep political division because one of the things I touch on as an example is, very briefly, is the attempt to impeach Andrew Johnson in a period of time when we didn't think in terms of polarization, but just deep political divisions coming out of the Civil War. Now, in doing this, I went back through some of my earlier work and some of the other work on how we view presidencies and how we view not just the individual presidents, the work of James David Barber and others and so forth, looking at their character and their individual personalities, but the institution itself. And generally, these descriptions fall into three time periods that share a set of relatively common characteristics. Yes, there are exceptions, but they are basically what we think of as the pre-modern, the modern, and the postmodern presidency, or as I've referred to them in other places as the impaired, the imperial, and the imperiled, because pre-modern, modern, and postmodern refer to time periods and not anything descriptive about the characteristics of the institution. The pre-modern or impaired is characterized by weak presidents and a dominant Congress, and a period of time when there's a relatively small federal government, both domestically and in terms of our foreign impact. The modern or imperial presidency, we're all familiar, comes to us primarily from that point of demarcation, the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, where the presidency begins to dominate domestic politics and policy. And the federal government is growing, at least initially, in response to the Great Depression and the development of Roosevelt's New Deal programs. And then with the onset of World War II and the United States' role in the world following World War II. So we have then a large presence in world politics. And then this last category is that of the postmodern or imperiled presidency, where it's difficult to accomplish things, both domestically and in foreign affairs. The world is of a very different order. This sort of lines up with the decline of the Soviet Union and the elimination of, in many people's minds, the bipolar world politics. It's no longer the U.S. and the USSR. It's now the U.S. for a very brief period of time as the one dominant power in the world, and then very quickly this sort of dispersed power from all over the world with rogue actors, rogue nations, and non-nation states acting to influence world politics. There's a somewhat resurgent Congress here, especially if you push this period back before the decline of the Soviet Union to perhaps the end of the Nixon administration and Watergate. And then again, we're going to see a little bit about two different definitions of when polarization begins. But either way, it lines up nicely with the postmodern president and the difficulty presidents have in pushing forward their agenda.
Hey Jim, your slideshow is not skipping through. If you're we only see your title page.
Oh, really?
Yeah. You might have to hit from current slide again or play from the beginning.
Hang on.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll have to do it this way instead. Make this full. All right. Can you see that now?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. I'll do it the old-fashioned way. Instead of as a PowerPoint slide, I'll just go from slide to slide.
Gotcha.
All right. So that was, I just completed this one, the views of the presidency. Next, this first table, I grabbed this, I forget the source now. It is from the University of California at Santa Barbara, their Center for the Study of the Presidency. And this is really a snapshot of the presidencies since Eisenhower. I start off talking about Eisenhower as sort of the last non-delegitimized or outside of this period of delegitimization of presidents and move forward from there. What we see here by looking at these results, if you want to look at the margin of victory as a measure of whether or not presidents would be delegitimized, approximately 37.5% of these elections since 1960 produced winners with less than 50% of the popular vote, and only about 1% more than the overall average. That is, it's about 36.6% or so of all the elections going back to Andrew Jackson when we started recording the popular votes that produced the same result, less than 50%, 36.6 or so percent of the time. The winner wins with less than 50% of the popular vote. And other measures taking a look at whether or not they were, for example, less than 5% margin and so forth, still produce about on average the same kind of results. So I think we can say that the margin of victory has less to do with whether or not an individual president is going to be delegitimized or an attempt is going to be made to delegitimize. That's not necessarily what's significant. And one of the first things you can look at here too is Bill Clinton, elected both times with less than 50% of the vote, yet he ends up as one of the most popular presidents ever in terms of overall consistency of approval rating and his outgoing approval rating, in spite of the fact that he had scandal after scandal and he was impeached. One thing we need to make clear, and one of the things I use as part of the narrative of this is Steve Kornacki's book, The Red and the Blue, is that polling at the time showed a distinct difference between his job approval rating, which is what's reflected here on this slide, versus his personal approval rating, which was rather low. In other words, the public thought, gee, this guy's great for my pocketbook and he's doing a good job, but I'm not sending my daughter to Washington to be an intern. And that's often how I describe that in class. Here with the Bush approval ratings, we see, again, here's a guy who lost the popular vote, yet was fairly popular going forward. Even in the very beginning of his administration, he had approval ratings that ranged between the low 50s and the low 60s. And then, of course, this huge spike is his approval rating following 9/11. And then a rather continuous decline in his approval rating such that he leaves office as one of the least popular presidents in history at the end of 2008 into 2009. Obama's approval rating, I like to describe this as the Batman graph, where Obama's approval looks almost like the wings of a bat here, rather elongated bat, but remains relatively high. He starts out near 70%, never falls below the upper 30s, and ends up close to 60% approval. Yet he's the target of one of the most vigorous campaigns to delegitimize. Obviously, if you can prove that an individual is not a natural born citizen, it disqualifies them from the presidency. And if you get enough people in the population to believe it, believe that the president is not a natural born citizen, it certainly delegitimizes that individual in terms of getting anything done, whether the charge is true or not. And then Trump's approval here, I did not have time to create the new graph that extended beyond 2018, but one of the things we know about Trump's approval rating, it performs in a very narrow band, except at the very end. More recent graphs of his approval show him dipping down into the low 30s right around the time of the insurrection or just following it. And here's one where approval rating and polarization may come together to prove to be at least a contributing factor or set of contributing factors to delegitimizing. Remember, after all, Donald Trump is the only president to be impeached twice. One of the measures that's readily available about the public and how the public may or may not be polarized. I mean, the DW Nominate score is a great tool for measuring polarization in government. One of the few measures we have available in terms of what the public thinks is this party gap measure from Gallup. It is simply looking at the approval of presidents within their political party versus the opposing party. So if you're looking at this particular table, Trump is approved by 85% of the Republicans and approved only by 8% of the Democrats. 85 minus 8 gives you the 77% party gap. So if the public is, this party gap then is a measure of the extent to which the public is polarized. What's interesting here is if you take a look at 1, 2, 3, 4, the top 4 presidents on this score, they all line up with Kornacki's definition of polarization. That polarization began when Bill Clinton provided an easy enough target for Newt Gingrich. So the top 4 presidents, in terms of the extent to which the public is polarized, happened since Clinton. And among these top 4, obviously, we have 2 presidents who were impeached, and one of those 2 presidents impeached twice. And that's the guy with the highest party gap measure. If you go down two more to Nixon on the list, he was not officially impeached, but skedaddled out of town before the House could actually take that vote. So with that brief examination of the data, I come away from looking at this definition, the initial definition I had of delegitimizing, and note that close elections are not apparently a cause or even related necessarily to delegitimizing efforts by the opponents of a president. What does seem to be most important here is polarization, or the more generic term, deep political division. This bullet point here essentially repeats what I just described to you from the last table. That again, the top four polarized presidencies by party gap measure, two of them were impeached and one of those twice. Nixon at number 6 was driven from office, though not officially impeached. The attempt to delegitimize Nixon still fits with Campbell's timeline for polarization. Jim Campbell notes that polarization likely began right after the adoption of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. And it's something I often refer to when I talk to my students about polarization. When you look at the reaction to that and Strom Thurmond's defection from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, and which begins sort of this, starts out as a drip, 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 and becomes a flood of conservative Southern Democrats transferring their allegiance from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, such that by about 1980, when we see the rise of Newt Gingrich, you have probably a regional realignment such that now the Republican Party is the dominant party in the South. And if you look at since 1968 and Richard Nixon's election, up till Barack Obama, the only two Democratic presidents who were elected were Democrats from the South. So even though the South's allegiance was tending toward the Republican Party, if you could find a quote unquote moderate Southern Democrat, that individual would still appeal to Southern voters and could get elected. So where do I take this next? Well, obviously, I've used the one measure of public polarization. I would like to then go and take a look at what the relationship is with the DW Nominate scores. I'm sure that the result is going to be pretty much the same, but it's nice to have that next level of confirmation. And I think I need to develop more detailed narratives, especially regarding Andrew Johnson, since there's not a whole lot of data available that would allow us to do the same kind of party gap measure there. And since these are the culprits, if you will, or the targets of delegitimizing that jump out from the initial investigation, I think we need more detailed narratives on Andrew Johnson, Richard Nixon, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump. And I look forward to Josh's comments. So I will stop the share and come back.
All right. Well, thank you, Jim. That was interesting. I've got plenty of ideas on that one too. So I am my own favorite voice. So I will start with Jared, and then we'll go just in order my comments of how everyone presented, and then we'll have a nice open discussion. So Jared, interesting paper. I always think it's fascinating when we see some stuff on defense spending, because you kind of hit it right. There's that conversation of, it's usually a polarized conversation of, is it too much or is it not enough? This went a little bit more into detail. So my basic comments right away, the paper's dense. It is heavy. It's like, I think it was 50 something pages long, and it's, so you can, some of that information you can pull back, especially like, there's a whole discussion of the methods is fantastic, but it's almost like a research methods class. Like you get into why you're doing like, and how to, fantastic stuff, especially if you're showing your students, your undergrads, like that's case in point, great stuff. But if you're going to try to like shape this down and send it out for a review or anything, you could pull some of that back. And there is some language about like the so-called and military industrial complex. Pull that back a little bit, especially coming from the military academy. They're going to be like, oh, he thinks this doesn't exist. You might get some reviewers to raise your eyebrows, so pull that back a little bit. But I think the number one thing that you should really think about with this paper, because I do think there's a lot here that's really good, is you have an endogeneity problem in the data. And you actually address it in the paper. You just don't know how to get at it. You address it in your presentation. It's the South issue, right? That smile, like how like that area. How do you measure that area, and how do you account for what's really driving that area? Is it like regionalism? Is it the senators? Who is it? And you try to account for it by like having specific senators. Actually, what you need to do is go to Richard Fording's website. And Richard Fording was a grad student of Berry and Berry, who did ideological scores of states and citizenry. And if you catch the ideological score of a state, you can then account for if a state's conservative or not. And if you account for that, then you might be able to get at the situation. Is it because the South just tends to be more conservative, the citizenry in the South? Or is it just that the senators are doing it a different way through appropriations, or how their ideology lines up? And I think that's the part you're missing. If you can catch that, his name's Richard Fording. If you catch that state ideology, you're going to find something kind of interesting there. And then that'll get you right back to accounting for the top portion of ideology versus partisanship, right? You're showing just because you're Republican doesn't mean you support defense spending. You have your extremists on either side. And really the conversation here is about ideology. Those conservative Democrats, maybe, and those kind of like hawkishy Republicans, like towards the middle, of course they're going to support Department of Defense spending. And that's really kind of what you're arguing here, is that it's, as we're seeing polarization, there is some overlap in polarization, and it's around ideology, not partisanship, which are two different things, and things that we kind of get wrong all the time. So does that make sense, Jared? Is that helpful?
Yeah, no, great, for sure. Taking a look at state ideology for sure, and the overlap by ideology. Yeah.
Have fun going down that rabbit hole, because I can see how you like to go down rabbit holes through that paper. So I just ruined a weekend for you. But I think it was really good, and I really like it. And I always like seeing when y'all come from the military academy, because it's just a different perspective, and I just truly appreciate it. So
Thank you. I appreciate the comments.
You're welcome. Anytime. All right, Harry. So I was excited by this paper. You don't know this, but my background, my dissertation is a constitutional law, American politics dissertation. So you kind of hit some of my love, and I'll give Jim credit for this from back in the day of undergrad for teaching this love. I think you're right. There's this nice blending coming. And I think you have a really interesting take on the idea. Like you kind of mentioned that you have an easy case study to kind of provide a straw man kind of argument for you. I think you're in the early stages of a dissertation chapter or a dissertation paper. That's what, if this is where you are, and that's okay, and that's truly okay. If you're trying to build an idea, so it's a very interesting take of a bigger discussion, and that's the number one thing I think about. This is a bigger idea, and that's okay, because I can see you kind of having this internal debate even in your presentation. It's in the paper. There's a lot of thought process going on here. And the number one thing I need you to really like step back from, if you really want to get into this, is you mention and you cite Louis Fisher, his 9/11 work, but I got one for you. You need. It's his Presidential War Powers book. This is all about the growth of executive power over civil liberties. This is so important to your argument, because he taps onto the idea of how that executive power grows, like you talked about it. But you also have a good idea of like how it steps back. So Fisher also comes up with why it steps back a little bit. And it's his other book, The Constitutional Conflicts. This will really help you develop, these two will help you develop this idea, because you're onto something, right? You're in that quintessential grad school moment where somebody maybe have told you, hey, look at this shelf in the literature. Where do you fit on this shelf of the literature? And you've kind of found a spot. You found that argument right there, that there's something missing here, because why does the presidential power sometimes come back after taking it during wartime? Why does Congress kind of get away with, overstepping their bounds? And I think my favorite part of the whole thing is the part about the Supreme Court. you really have nailed that. Like, there's always that check and balance, right, of like the Supreme Court and Congress and the presidency, but you've kind of found a backdoor that it's a check that no one's really paying attention to. And it really is through, I mean, we're lucky right now to find it. It's polarization's kind of letting that check not happen, but no one's really paying attention to it. But as you, I think, are probably sitting there just thinking about it, you saw it. So I think the number one thing is you've got to kind of come back, read Fisher a little bit. And then your conclusion of your paper is really the hook, right? And I don't want to send you down a path like this is your dissertation, but you start talking about Guantanamo and the more modern era and how we've had this, if you look at state politics, they call it ad hoc federalism period. It's the end of devolution, like federalism of the 70s and 80s. It's that post 9/11, like just everybody, Republicans and Democrats, are taking power and like using the executive power, even though the Republicans are like, no, limited government, don't look what we're doing. It's this whole period, and you've kind of said like, hey, we have issues with civil liberties here, issues on Guantanamo, issues with Trump, issues under the Obama administration. And why is no one really paying attention to it? Because really, you've kind of hit it. It's the administration, but it's the congressional acts that happened during the administration. And it's almost like the presidency is providing like an umbrella coverage of like, oh, blame the president, when it's really Congress who's doing it. And it's just an interesting idea, and one that like it really could be explored in deep detail. And you use this stuff from like World War II, but there's a reason, because you kind of point to how the similarities of what was happening then, you can kind of see some of it now. And yeah, you use McCarthyism. That's a fun hook, but it's right. I mean, straw men exist for a reason, and it's not really like, I wouldn't even say it's a straw man, because we have the hindsight of 2020 to know that's right. So it would be, I just think there's something there. And it's something really worth exploring. And if you read those two books by Fisher, plus the one that you already have in there, you're going to see where your idea really fits in. And then you're going to have a stronger background. But it's that presidential war power that he really explains it, that you found the hole in, of like why he couldn't fully explain in the first book why Congress is getting away with things. So does that help? Does that make some sense to you?
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. I mean, enjoy it. It's fun. If you really like this stuff, it really will get you thinking about it. And like I said, on that shelf, you found a hole. It's small, but that's all you need. You just need a little space. Just elbow yourself in there.
Thanks a lot.
You're welcome. All right, Eric, you're next. Really interesting idea, Eric. And I think you stole my thunder right from the beginning. We're like, this is really just a methodological piece, and that was kind of my argument. I'm like, well, you need the front end of this paper, right? But it's kind of a cool idea, right? Like, of just like, why do we sometimes just say like, we will pass off the little like enactments of Congress, they don't really matter. It would be nice to have a measure of all of those, of all of it, and of course, in the end, you kind of find out, right? Like, the Congress, it seems like the Congress that have the biggest enactments are the most kind of, active in general. That seems a little no duh and right, but there's nothing wrong with kind of a no duh right finding if no one's ever kind of put it in paper, because it would be nice to be able to cite somebody, say like, see, we know it's happening, but here it is. And of course, as you mentioned Mayhew, that none of us here are Mayhew. So like getting that finding published in a big journal is going to be fun. But it's an important finding that people can cite to. So you just got to find a hook at the beginning. If this is something what you want, of like, here's a case study of an idea. Here's my idea of like Taylor, whatever it was, and here's how it relates. Because I think you have, I mean, I might be wrong, but I think it sounds kind of nice to have like a footnote finding of like, yeah, everything we've thought is right, and here's a way to measure it. I mean, there's nothing wrong with being the measurement guy. Do you think?
No, yeah. I mean, I'm that guy in the department.
Yeah.
So, it is what it is. I mean, I do measurement and everything. I do other stuff too, legal stuff or ideology and stuff. But I mean, this is something I was thinking you could just do as, in a short 4,000 word political analysis, throw it in there. They throw it on the back of the issue, right? It's a couple of thousand,
Right.
you're off and
One of
running.
those, or I'll be honest with you, if you have like if you develop a little bit of the front end, I mean, one of these larger state conferences with a journal that has like readability, I don't know how this would affect with Sam Houston, but has like Google Scholar readability or any of the dashboards that get them like kind of an impact rating, I think that'd be good too. So
Yeah.
but it's
Yeah.
not your
I mean,
team.
I only wrote the paper. I only wrote it in like 2 days. So, I was quickly jamming it through. So I do need to, step back, and what you see there will probably have to be really clawed apart and, focused.
I get that, but don't lose the important part of it, right? Like that you kind of measured something that needed to be measured.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
Like, and it's nice. So I liked it. So I can't give you a ton there, but
Right.
I think you know what's next, which is good.
Right. And my goal with presenting it was just to see if this thing had any legs, right? You want to see if everybody looks at you like you're crazy,
Right.
then okay, it's time to put that one on the back burner.
No, I don't think you. I mean, and maybe I'm wrong, but because I have a piece about Confederate statues that like the conservatives like Confederate statues and things like that, and it makes sense, but no one really was like measured it. So I measured it with a couple
Right.
of colleagues, and now it's been cited a lot. It helps that kind of argument. Like,
Right.
see,
Right.
I think you're right there. It has legs to me, man.
Okay, good.
All right, and then last and certainly not least, Jim. I will just a little caveat. Jim kind of let me know that this is probably an idea for a book. And I think that's a good thing because as soon as I'm reading it, I see where this is going. I think it's a good idea. It's incredibly timely. You get it. And it made me think right away, like delegitimizing a candidate is as American as apple pie. Like we're doing this from the beginning. And if you have a book, you can kind of go through the history of making the other candidate look like a fool. And you can just start with like Adams and Jefferson fighting, like, and just move it forward. Like I kind of like to Jackson and Quincy Adams. Then you went and have Lincoln in the paper. And then of course the election of 1876, and then get to your conversation, because you can build this kind of a nice background of like making the other person look foolish. But how did that happen? Like when somebody was kind of delegitimized and foolish, but it didn't seem until more of the modern era where that has led to complete delegitimizing. And that's what I think is kind of really like your argument there. And I think, I mean, you mentioned Campbell. I'm guessing you're using Polarized by Campbell. That was going to be my biggest comment. You got his argument about social media and the bottom up effect of social media when we think everything's a top down effect. I think he's right. Not just because like I learned from him, but I think he's right. Which, if anybody knows Jim Campbell, that's the last thing you want to tell him is that he's right. Like, I love him to death, but you don't want to. Like, but he's right, and it kind of comes up in this. I think it's that growth of the 24-hour news cycle. It's social media. Kornacki nailed it. Like that. Like Clinton just made it too easy. Like.
So the only difference between Campbell and Kornacki really is the timing.
Right.
Campbell comes at it with a scholarly approach, Kornacki with a journalistic approach. They've got the same basic idea, that they just disagree on the date.
Pretty much. It's like anytime like Bartels and like Campbell get together, they're making the same argument, but they'll never agree. But yeah, and I think about it this way, like that growth of social media, and then you get the Trump, right, and like Obama and the birther. That's your argument, right? That's the fun part. Well, I mean, fun for some people.
Not if you were Obama.
Right, not if you're Obama, but like the growth of 4chan or then 8chan. You can even have a lot of fun with like the QAnon right crazies, like, and that kind of whole discussion in a book form. You can really kind of, you're talking about modern political history, and then like, and then it can spread off to the polarization of the presidency, Congress, and even the Supreme Court. Like the Supreme Court being the institution that wasn't supposed to be politicized. We know it's political, but now it's like, I mean, Kavanaugh and Coney Barrett, like that's, I mean, we're talking big things. So you have a great idea of a great story. I think it's really timely. And I think you would be a really nice blend of bringing like Kornacki and Campbell together, like, because Campbell's book sometimes is just hard to get through, and like when he gets really like dense and like with quant, and then Kornacki has the journalistic side, which makes it really fun to read, but you need a little bit more.
Right.
You can do both, and then make it accessible to not only like undergrad but grad students and people in general in audience, right? Which is nice. So I think
that's where the money is in writing books.
Right.
The general audience.
Yeah, that's where the money is. Don't tell the academics. Like, they'll just sell them to their students. But other than that, though, I think it's fun. I think it's especially because we just lived through it. And I always find it interesting, though, that like everyone talks about the Capitol Hill police officer that died, and no one mentions the rioter who died, like during it. I always wonder, like, should she get a footnote? Yeah, she was on she'll be on the wrong side of history most likely. But I mean, on live TV, she was on a gurney. So so there's always that. I just think it's kind of fascinating because
I think part of that difference is she made the conscious choice to be there,
right?
Whereas the Capitol Police officer was just doing his duty.
Right. I agree with that. So I just always find it interesting, though. But, all right. Well, hey, I can open it up to everybody else because again, I can keep talking, but nobody wants that. So.
The one thing I was thinking, if I could cut in for Jim, that I saw a piece today on Real Clear Politics, a little article, nothing to do with what you're talking about, but the term that this person used was really, I think, apropos to what you're doing. And this guy talked about some college recently where a black student wrote like KKK stuff on the wall, faked a thing of a racist attack, right? And that's not what I want to get to here. But what the author said, and I forgot his name, I don't even know who it was, who cares, said that, you know what, sometimes when you're on one side of the argument, there's not enough of a supply for the things that you think will, inflame your passions. That is, you're looking for racists, they're there, but you can't find them, so you create it. Maybe what you're talking about here is that we're looking to delegitimize somebody. We don't like them, but they're legitimate because they're there. Right? They're going through everything in the office. So we have to find ways to delegitimize these people and knock them down. And then if you look at Nixon in the other way in reverse, there was not a demand for looking for delegitimizing him, but the supply was there because he did the act. Right. So it's actually different. So I was just thinking that, that what I saw today was like a perfect way of describing what you're doing. You have to find it. You can't find the delegitimization except at the end for Trump, and Trump's a unique case. I don't think you'll ever see anything like him again, but that's another story for another day. But I just wanted to share that. I didn't know if that would make any sense to you, but it's just something that thought. I said, he's really looking at this as it's kind of like in this way. So sorry.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. I think it gets to a certain extent. You mentioned it. Josh made the distinction. I sort of hint at it in one or two sentences, but don't run with it in the paper. And that is the difference between attempting to delegitimize a candidate and delegitimizing a sitting president. There's sort of a differentiation there, I think, between undermining a candidate's credibility and qualifications versus saying, yeah, that guy sitting in that office doesn't belong there because he committed a crime, or
we don't like him.
More than we don't like him, but he's different from us,
right?
Or maybe there's a rumor that he's not really a natural born citizen. Yeah. So I think that's a difference, and I think if polarization continues for a longer period of time, we might see more efforts at delegitimizing. They haven't really gone after Biden yet on that basis, unless maybe they think that because he can't control his dog that's a delegitimizing argument.
Right. But the campaign they sure did, right? If you go down that road, calling him like weak, he Alzheimer's, all that kind of stuff.
Right. Yes.
And being a drug addict. Yeah.
Right. But that's different from now that he's in office. He's sort of getting the same sort of normal honeymoon period that other presidents have gotten in the past. But we'll see how long that lasts.
If his dog keeps biting.
Yeah. I would think he's the type guy you wait out. So if you're on the other side, you just wait for the catastrophe to happen and then you have them. Mm-hmm. Right. So if the market, if we slip into a recession in the end of the year, next year or something, that our inflation goes out of control, that's what you wait for, because, he's a nice guy. You don't want to, he's not Trump, right? He's not so.
Right.
I have a question for Eric. So part of your tale score, would you take a look at like how people retrospectively look at bills? So like the 1994 crime bill had very high bipartisan support, but now in 2020 it was used, as an attack on President Biden. So would that go into account, or just be like the time and space legislation?
No, I don't, because I can't figure out the big thing I would love to be able to do is to figure out how do you actually signify what a landmark law is. When you talk about the Y2K planning bill, that doesn't seem to hit the marks for me, but it's in the list. And I would think, to me, that truly landmark legislation should be far and few between. These should be the things that are really, like if you're talking about Baseball Hall of Fame, do you want to be a big hall or a small hall guy? It should be a small hall thing. So if you think about the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, all of these different types of things would be there. Other things would be there. But I don't know how to get to that just yet. That's a little bit more sophisticated. So no, I don't look at that in particular. I'm just kind of putting things into these categories and then measuring it from there. But I'd like to be able to somehow distinguish between stuff like that. But it's a lot. You're talking, if you look at the U.S. statutes at large from 1789, we're probably talking 80 to 90,000 plus line items, probably 100,000 line items to go through. I mean, there's a lot in there if you go through every chapter, and I think it may be even more than that because I haven't gotten all the way down there. I mean, just from the 80th to the 115th Congress, we're talking about, I think it's about 50,000 laws. So, I mean, it's a lot to get through. So I just don't have that ability just yet to do what you asked. Sorry.
You need some more grad students, but I think the impact score might be I think that's what's going to be the thing that's going to help you measure it, is like for landmark.
Right.
All right. Anybody else? Any other?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of ask something or suggest something for Jim's paper. Obviously, I haven't read it. I just had what you had today, so you might have addressed it. But you talked about impeachment, and I'm wondering if there's a piece in here about investigations that are not impeachment, and I think that is a pretty big thread of delegitimization. I mean, if we're talking about the Obama administration, definitely this Benghazi investigation is a major flashpoint. Even to some extent, the Too Fast, Too Furious, or the Fast and Furious investigation of the Holder Justice Department, but particularly with Trump. I mean, the investigations are very, very important in terms of Democratic attempts to delegitimize Trump to such an extent that it ends up being a Supreme Court case, kind of an unprecedented Supreme Court case in Trump v. Mazars. And there, Justice Thomas is like, well, none of this is acceptable. You have to impeach him if you want to investigate him. But then, of course, Trump is saying, well, even in impeachment, you can't investigate me. But in any event, I guess I'm wondering if you're seeing a space in this article or this book for investigations in general rather than just impeachments.
I'm thinking, I hadn't thought along those lines, but as soon as you said it, it makes sense. I mean, if you even go back to Reagan, the investigations into Iran-Contra, where there was even background talk of the possibility of impeaching him, but it didn't come up to that level of what many would think would be an impeachable offense. But there was the talk about the possibility of doing that. But there was the very middle of the day ratings busting coverage of that joint committee of Congress investigating Iran-Contra and Ollie North's testimony. As soon as you said it, that's immediately what popped into my head. And yeah, that would make sense in terms of looking at I don't know how to characterize it, but those kinds of investigations that get a lot of news coverage, but maybe don't end up going anywhere. And certainly you could make that argument with the investigations into Benghazi and Hillary Clinton. And there, more importantly than undermining Obama, those were designed to undermine Hillary Clinton as a potential candidate. So we could even look at the attempt to undermine a candidate before he or she is even formally a candidate.
I like that.
Yeah.
So. Well, all right. Well, we got a few minutes left. If there's any final questions, but if not, this has been, I think, a really interesting panel and a good discussion. So
I just had something for Harry.
Please.
I thought his paper was very interesting. I've read a lot on that, of the congressional abdication of, particularly in war powers, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought what you were doing, Harry, was interesting because you seem to be talking about the legislature in this case and the legislature's role in it. So that's kind of the opposite of, it's always usually executive power that you think about. There's a book, I forgot by it too. It's called Is Administrative Law Unlawful? And he brings up this great point about the bureaucracy. If you're looking at maybe how Congress is given this authority to the executive, and particularly the executive, since they oversee the federal agencies, about how many bureaucracies, in theory and probably in practice, violate the separation of powers. Why? Because they have both executive, legislative, and adjudicative powers all wrapped up in one institution. Right? If you think about the separation of powers, these things should be a Congress writes law, the president enacts law, signs law and executes law, and the court reviews those decisions. But federal agencies, some federal agencies, do all of those things in one. And so he talks about this, and this may be another way of thinking about how you could look at how these how this power is expanded, particularly in these ways, particularly through the administrative review or judicial, particularly regulatory review. That's where presidents really exercise most of their power, is through regulatory review. So you may be able to find something there that may help you, in particular in foreign policy, where a lot of this happens. So I just maybe that might be something that could help.
That's a great suggestion. Thanks.
Well, all right. So I'm gonna we should probably shut it down, but I want to thank you all for meeting at this time. We kind of turned it around quickly. The papers were great. The discussion was a really good time. If you have any follow up, I'm easy to reach. My email is just joshuamedall@clayton.edu. If you type in anything close to that on Google, you'll find me. There's not many of us. So on that note, I appreciate you all, and I will stop the recording, and I'll catch you all at the next panel. Thank you again.
Bye.
Hey,